Hey everybody, so welcome to really our first section of our first unit for government. So today what we're going to be discussing really three different things within what are the origins and what are the purposes of government. So if you are watching this from home, obviously watch this video, and as we go along, make sure that you are taking any notes needed to help you understand. All right. So our first unit for government is the foundations of what is government. Okay, and you can see here our quote from Thomas Jefferson: "The will of the people is the only legitimate foundation of any government." Okay, so like I said, there are going to be three different things that we're going to be discussing of the foundations of government for today and the origins. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what are the differences between a nation, state, and country. All right. Typically, when we're talking about these three different things, people like to say that nations and countries are the same thing. And obviously, here in the United States, when we think of the term state, we think of maybe places like Indiana, Ohio, Michigan. But those terms aren't really the same thing. Okay, so let's first start with nation. All right, so a nation is technically just a sizable group of people who align themselves or who believe that they are united by common bonds. All right, bonds such as race, language, customs, or religion. All right, so a good example of a nation, think about Native Americans. Okay, the Cherokee Nation. All right. Now, usually here in the United States, when we're talking about nation, we are united by, maybe language, the English language, maybe some of our customs, right? But we're not necessarily a nation because there are differences within that. There are differences in race. There are differences in language, okay? There are differences in customs, and there are definitely differences in religion. All right, so that's nation. So let's talk about what is a state. Okay, like I said, usually many people in the United States, when they think about a state, they think about a state as a subdivision of a whole country, like the state of Indiana. But the term state is just a political community, right, that occupies a defined territory and has a government. So, usually, when we're talking about state and we're talking about like the state of Indiana, we're not necessarily using the correct term. So, like I said, state, it's a political community, has a defined territory, and also a government. So what is a country? Well, technically, the term country has the same definition of a state. So, the term country has the same meaning. Now, not anybody can become a country/state. There are different criteria that you need to meet in order to be considered one of them. So, our major essential features of a state. Right? So, if you want to be considered a country/state, you have to have four things. The first thing, you need to have a population. Okay, that's kind of self-explanatory. The next thing you need to have is territory. Now that makes sense because if we look at our definition of state, it's a political community that occupies a defined territory, so obviously you have to have land. Now the third thing, and it's the most important, is sovereignty. Now most people don't really know what sovereignty is, so I'm going to tell you what it is. So sovereignty, it just means that a government can make and enforce its own laws without approval from any other authority. So, yes, Indiana is a state. However, it doesn't have sovereignty because it does not have complete authority. Okay? A lot of times it has to look back to our federal government or our national government for the go-ahead on certain things. And then the last thing that a state has to have, and again it's in our definition, is a government. Somebody has to be in charge. Okay. So now that we know what a nation, what a state, and what a country is, let's talk about why in the world would people come together and form a political community or a government, I guess. Now, there are four main theories that people like to think of, and the first one's called evolutionary theory. And some scholars believe that the notion of the state or of the government evolved from family dynamics. Okay, so the head of ancient families served as the authority over the group, and extended families oftentimes included hundreds of people. Okay, typically when we're looking at the evolutionary theory and the family dynamic for why people came together to form quote-unquote governments, the men were heads of the family, specifically the fathers. So that's our first theory. Our second theory is called force theory. All right, so according to the force theory, states emerged when people needed to cooperate in order to survive. And the only way that they were going to cooperate for survival is if they came together to work together, right? For example, maybe to keep out enemies, people needed to build walls around their city. And usually the strongest leaders used violence or the threat of violence to control their own people to get the work done. All right, so a state emerged when everyone in an area was brought together under the authority of one person or group, usually by use of force. Hey, we live in the same community. I have the most power. I'm the strongest of all of us, so I'm going to be in charge. And you are going to listen to me, because if you don't, you are not going to survive. All right, let's talk about our third theory, the divine right theory. This theory was really popular throughout world history. So, the idea that certain people are chosen by a god or gods to rule, like I said, it's very old. The ancient Egyptians, Chinese, Mayans, and Aztec all believed that their rulers were descendants of gods, or that they were chosen by the gods to rule. Now, the divine right theory became really popular within European monarchs in the 1600s and the 1700s. And the kings would be like, hey, you know, you don't like what I'm doing? Well, that's between you and God, because he put me here. And if you oppose me as the monarch, then you are opposing God. And therefore, you're not only being treasonous, but you're being sinful, and you might go to hell if you don't do what I say. All right, and then let's look at our very last theory. It's called the social contract theory. So some people believe that government exists to protect and to serve their people. Without a state or government, people would live in what is known as a state of nature, which is life without government. And people believe that life without government is, quote, nasty, brutish, and short. All right. So we're going to learn about two different major political thinkers here in the next couple days. The first one we're going to learn about is Thomas Hobbes. Now, Thomas Hobbes, with the state of nature theory or the social contract theory, he believed that without government, you know, people are naturally bad, so what's going to stop me from hitting you on the head and stealing all your coconuts? Okay, so he believed that social contract theory, the government's there to protect us, and we need to have a very, very powerful government because people are just naturally evil, right? The other person we're going to learn about, his name is John Locke. He had a different view on the social contract theory. He claimed that people had natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and that a social contract was made between the people and their government, and the government promised to preserve those rights. Now, obviously, when you think of life, liberty, or property, you might think of the Declaration of Independence that says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And John Locke's ideas about the social contract theory are really going to shape the development of our own government. Okay? All right, so we have talked about what is the difference between a nation, state, and country. We've talked about the purposes, or not the purposes, but the origins of government, all the different theories. So let's talk about what are the purposes of government. Why in the world do we have them? What are they supposed to do? All right. So most humans can't function, or we don't want to live in chaos, right? I don't want to live in a world where I'm looking over my shoulder all the time. You know, is my next door neighbor going to hit me on the head with a hammer and steal my coconuts? Because life without government, it's described as anarchy. All right, there's nobody there to enforce the rules or protect me, really. Okay, so there are 5 main purposes of government. The first one is to simply provide leadership, right? Government officials, they set priorities, they make decisions on things for my behalf. They decide what actions are crimes. They make decisions about who has to pay taxes, how much they have to pay, who benefits from those taxes. All right, so they just simply provide leadership. Our next major purpose is they then maintain order. Right? So in nearly any group, people are going to disagree about things. People are going to try to take advantage of others. Like I said, my neighbor and I might argue about things, and the government is there to maintain that order, to make sure that conflict is resolved. Because really, conflict is an inescapable part of life, right? You and I might agree on different things, and we may really get into big arguments, and maybe the government would have to step in to fix those arguments. Okay? So let's look at this quote from Abraham Lincoln. It says, "The legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they do not have done but cannot do it all, or what they need to have done but cannot do it all, or cannot so well do for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. But in all of that people can individually do for themselves, government ought not to interfere." So, our third main purpose is to provide public services, all right? I can't necessarily build a sewer system, so the government's going to do that for me. I myself, I don't know how to pave roads, so the government's going to do that for me, okay? So obviously governments do lots of things. They create schools, build sewer systems, pave roads, provide lots and lots and lots of other services that I cannot do on my own. Right? And that's kind of what Lincoln is saying here, right? He says, the government should do for me what I can't do. But whatever I can do on my own, the government shouldn't help me. All right? So, provide public services. All right, the next major purpose is to provide national security. All right? The government needs to protect me against attack from other countries or maybe even terrorists. And in today's world where we have nuclear weapons, spy satellites, terrorists, huge armies, it's a really complex and demanding task for the government to provide me with national security. All right, so the U.S. federal government is primarily responsible for this task. Some state governments have informal relations with other nations, but at the end of the day, it is the federal government's job to provide me with national security. All right, and then the last purpose for government is to provide economic security and assistance. And I will tell you that this last main purpose is widely contested to the extent that it should be used in the United States today. All right, so governments protect the economic security of their people just like they protect national security. Governments negotiate trade deals with other countries. They try to protect businesses here in the United States. Governments might also intervene in economic affairs to promote their own national security. If we think back to, let's say, World War II, the United States funded the Marshall Plan to help European nations rebuild their economies. All right. So within their own countries, governments can also set policies to protect people's economic security. Think back to just a couple months ago with the coronavirus and how the government upped the amount of unemployment paid. That is a good example of that. Okay. So even in a wealthy country like the United States, many people lack enough food, necessary clothing, adequate housing. And so the problem of scarcity is far greater in other nations. And governments can provide assistance to people in need. This assistance might be in the form of food stamps, unemployment pay, like I just mentioned, control on how much rent landlords can charge. And governments really vary greatly in their ability to provide economic assistance. It just varies by nation. You go to some European countries and it will look very different from here in the United States and vice versa. All right, guys, that is all of our notes for today. Pretty quick, just about 15 minutes. We looked at the purposes and origins of the government. We talked about why do we have government, how did governments come about, and what really is the definition for a state, nation, and country. So your activity that you're going to be doing, you are going to be looking at some primary sources on what the state of nature actually is, and you're going to get to read a couple of different things. You're going to look at some different movies that are going to talk about movies that show the state of nature. And then if you have any questions, if you have any comments or concerns, just send me an email and I will get back to you as soon as possible. But I will see all of you later. Goodbye.